Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this next episode of In the Nick of Time. We're going to get started in about 10 minutes with David. We're going to be talking about open source software and its supply chain and security and why all this matters to all organizations on the planet. So stay tuned. We're going to get started in about 10 minutes. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this next episode of In the Nick of Time. We're going to get started in about 5 minutes with David, from the Linux Foundation. It's going to be a lot of fun talking about open source and supply chain security, and why, honestly, it matters to any organization on the planet. No matter you realize it or not, you're using open source, including in open source, including in commercial software as well. So stay tuned. We're going to get started in about 5 minutes with David. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining again. This next episode of In the Nick of Time, we're going to have a lot of fun today to talk to David about open source and supply chain security and why it matters to everybody here. That's going to be very interesting also to dig into the work being done at the White House with the OpenSSF. So stay tuned. We're going to get started now. But before that, want to remind everybody, please, to subscribe to the show so we can make sure you get the notifications about the next episode. So if you go to inthenickoftime.tv, you're going to be able to do that and just give your email, and you're going to get one email a week to be able to know who the next guest is going to be. And you're going to see that next week we have another amazing guest joining us, the August 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern, with Armin from HashiCorp, the co-founder and CTO. So it's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to dig into how they created HashiCorp and all of the products with Vault and Sentinel and so on. It's going to be a very deep dive on the service mesh and zero trust side of things as well. So stay tuned next week at 1 p.m. as well. Also wanted to remind everybody we're going to be launching in August, about mid-August, to be more precise, the new learning platform, Learn with Nick. It's a self-learning course, but it's continuous learning with new content every week, with a full course on digital transformation, DevSecOps, zero trust, cyber, with 40 plus segments, plus one new segment every other week, and plus one Q&A live session with me live as well every other week. So that's going to be a lot of fun with a full community of practice. So if you're interested in becoming one of the member of the Learn with Nick platform, make sure you send us a DM on LinkedIn so we can add you to the wait list. We're already 5,000 subscribers. Pretty amazing. It's going to be a very strong community with a lot of Fortune 500 companies paying 200, 300, 400, 500 seats from companies in telcos, banks, healthcare, a lot of DoD-related organization, and also 5 nations with 5 Eye and a little bit of NATO as well. So it's going to be a lot of fun to share and learn together. So stay tuned for the launch of Learn with Nick in about 2 weeks. All right, so now I'm going to bring our guest today, but first I want to give you a quick rundown on what David Wheeler has been working on. And he's obviously an expert on open source software and developing secure software. His work include the Open Source Security Foundation, OpenSSF, Secure Software Development Fundamental courses, and the mind-boggling Fully Countering Trusting Trust through Diverse Double Compiling, DDC. Always a simple title, but very good stuff. I read it, so you have to read it too. He developed also back in 2009, really what was the first DoD policy on open source. He is now the director of open source supply chain security at the Linux Foundation, and because he has nothing else to do except working 20 hours a day, is also teaching a graduate course in developing secure software, obviously, at George Mason University. And because he loves the university so much, he has a PhD in information technology, a master in computer science, one certificate in information security, one certificate in software engineering, a BS in electronics and engineering, all from GMU. He's also a CSSP and part of the IEEE, and he lives, like me, in Virginia. So we're going to bring David now. Give me a second to bring him on the screen. Here we go. Hey, David, welcome.
Hello. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we're so excited to have you. You've done so much, and I don't know how you find the time to get all these degrees. I have 0 degrees, so you beat me pretty easily since I only have a high school diploma.
Skip
So I don't even
sleeping.
know if that
It's
counts
really
for something.
yeah. Skip sleeping.
So
It's the simplest approach.
yeah, I guess you don't sleep much. So first, like I always ask our guests, if you don't mind, give us a little bit of your background and your journey since you started.
Okay. Well, you know what? When we start at the beginning, as far as computing goes, I was really interested in electronics when I was in elementary school, And when I was in middle school, I discovered something called a computer. Now, the computer, the first computer I ever used had 4 words, PDP-8. So things have gotten a whole lot better and a lot more capable since then. Uh,
Just a tiny bit.
yeah,
I'm pretty
yes,
sure, IoT devices, even 10 years ago, could do better than this. So.
oh yes, a 10-cent CPU would do better today. So, but you know what? It was a start, and although of course it didn't have the capabilities of even a trivial computer today, I can immediately see this is amazing. You can tell it to do things; it'll go do them. This is extraordinary. And I ended up. I went to school. I did various kinds of consulting tasks. One job I had before I'd even graduated, which I always thought was kind of fun, was actually a lot of fun at the time, was I was the maintainer of the world's first commercial multiplayer role playing game, which was a fun thing. However, the company folded, so my stock options worth nothing. Went back to consulting. And after I graduated, I joined one of the companies that I was actually consulting for at the time, the Institute for Defense Analyses, which I think a lot of your listeners already know who they are. It's a nonprofit, tries to give good advice primarily to the U.S. government. Uh, Stayed there for many years. Even before that, I was working on, at least to some extent, on security, just trying to figure out how to defend systems better. And over time, I got more and more interested, more involved in that. How do we secure the software that we're developing? Uh, I also got more and more interested in open source software because that was clearly something we were using a lot of. And so I kept doing more and more of that, trying to deal with that. And in 2020, I got an interesting offer from the Linux Foundation. So from 2020 on, I've actually been working for the Linux Foundation, and you already read my title. So I'm interested, gee, what's my title mean? Basically, I'm a subject matter expert. I cannot rewrite all the software in the world. That is not reasonable. But what I can do is go around to various projects, particularly ones with the Linux Foundation, and try to help them improve the security of the software that we all depend on. A good portion of my work nowadays is with the Open Source Security Foundation, whose overall mission is to improve the security of open source software. And I imagine we'll talk more about that as we go along. But that's kind of my journey. I've been working on, how do I just like software in general, love learning. But more recently, in the last couple of decades, I've been focusing much more on open source software or developing secure software or that combination.
Well, I can tell you after that introduction, everybody actually expects you to go and fix all open source software on the planet because
Excellent. Give me a day.
So you need to do that because everybody is pretty impressed by your credentials. So
Well, thank you.
a lot of work there. So now you can do the same and go fix open source for us. Okay.
Excellent.
All right. So let's dig into the real meat here. Obviously, we know that attacks are ramping up. What do you see we can do to prevent those attacks?
Okay, well, let me actually respond a little bit to that question because I think there's an important thing I'd like to emphasize here, which is we actually can't prevent attackers from trying to attack systems. I know that some people, we can try to dissuade, but I think there's been some interesting strategic studies that basically say we are not going to be living in a world where we can convince attackers to just stop trying. So instead, what we need to do is acknowledge that attackers are attacking, they will continue to attack, and that we need to prevent them from succeeding, either because the software is designed so and its processes are designed so that's very, very hard to attack, or we detect and respond to those attacks so that they don't have they have relatively little harm. And there's a lot of ways we can do that, but I think that's that first step is admit the attackers aren't going to stop. We need to actually address the situation.
All right, so that's the first step. So how do we start, I guess, mitigating or maybe diminishing the outcomes and the
The
impact on
outcomes.
the organizations?
Excellent. Well, the first step that I would go to, strange as it may seem, is education. And I don't mean get a PhD, although I think I got one. It was fun. It's certainly not for everybody, but there's a huge number of things that you as a software developer can do that don't take a lot of time and really make the attacker's life far, far more difficult. If you don't know where else to go, I would suggest go to the OpenSSF.org site, and on the top of it, you can see a training link that links off to the Secure Software Development Fundamentals courses. Go click there. It's free. Takes about 14 to 18, say 16 hours, which you can, it's an online course. You can just, take an hour or two as you go. I think it's interesting. I think other people found it interesting, and it will prepare software developers for a whole lot of those things where there's lots of little simple things you can do that make it much, much harder to attack software. The first step is to know what to do. Now, after you know what to do and start applying those things, are there other things you can do? Absolutely. If you're developing open source software, and I imagine we're going to talk more about open source software, there's something called the best practices badge. Try to earn a badge. It'll help you get there. Use lots of tools. The reality is tools are imperfect. They won't find everything. They will find things that turn out not really be vulnerabilities, but trying to do everything manually doesn't make any sense. So you should have a continuous integration pipeline, and you should get tools into the pipeline to look for vulnerabilities. No, they won't find everything. No, some of the findings will be wrong, and you have to tell the tool, nah, ignore that. But they're still incredibly useful, really necessary long scale. And there's different kinds. We can talk about that. And because most software is actually other people's software that's reused, you need to have you need to monitor for known dependencies, known vulnerabilities, and what you depend on. Turn on various tools to look for vulnerabilities and what you depend on, and get those automatically and rapidly updated. Which means you need to be prepared to rapidly update when there's a vulnerability in something you depend on. Use package managers, use automated tests. I mentioned dependencies because, as I said, most software is actually other people's software. Even if you only limit it to open source software. Synopsys and Sonatype did some studies. They found anywhere from 70 to 90% of software is actually just the open source software. Okay, not even including the proprietary use components. So before you bring them in, evaluate them. Are you sure that's the right one you need? One of the most common attacks is something called typo squatting. Somebody creates almost the right project name. So double check that name of that software that you're bringing in. Is that the one you meant to bring in? Does it seem to be trying to be secure? And then make it easy for your users to update. And overall, I would just say continuously improve. You're just basically just like anything else in your software. You want to try to make it better. You also want to make its security better. So, I mean, there are other things you can do, but hopefully that gives you kind of a broad list of the kinds of things. And none of these are there's no miracles here. It's straightforward. Learn and apply what we've learned.
No doubt, no miracles, but it takes a lot of work. Like you said, you mentioned learning, but you also mentioned tools. You mentioned kind of the importance of timeliness of updating software, and kind of the the lack of complacency of some teams to make sure that we're not compounding tech debt. So when you think of the timeliness aspect of things, how quickly are we really talking about that you need to worry about updating critical findings? I see some people that take way too long, in my opinion, but are we talking hours, minutes, days? What are we talking about?
I don't think there's a single number because it depends on a variety of factors. Anywhere from the attackers basically are also have a cost benefit analysis they have to do. They want to get the maximum benefit from an attacker's point of view from the least cost for them. You can, by thinking ahead and making it harder to attack, and reducing the result, the impacts when if an attack does succeed, you can make it at least less likely that you're in the crosshairs. But you asked your question, I think, in exactly the right way, which is, how quickly do you need to? And the answer better not be it's the time the CIO says or the Ciso says. The Ciso does not decide when you get attacked. The attacker decides when you get attacked. And so you need to work within the OODA loop of the attacker, not the
Many are automated now, right? So sometimes you don't, the attacker can completely automate at least the discovery phase. So
That's right. That's right. So generally, you asked me a question, so let me give you an overly simplistic, but I think at least the kind of time frame. We're talking about hours and days, not weeks, certainly not months, certainly not years. If you're waiting for your ship to get back to port before you update, you've already been taken over.
right.
Okay, that's how to ensure that your systems are taken over. Unless, of course, there's no connectivity, including
Right.
and that sort of
Which
thing. And
never
even that,
really exists. There's always something somewhere. They keep saying air gap, but then you find out there's sneaky ways of connecting to things.
right. And Stuxnet showed that air gaps aren't really as strong as people wanted to think they were.
Right.
The reality is that yes, you do need to update. No, you can't wait forever. If you're waiting for a year plus to update, you've already kind of screwed up. So
What's your take on some companies that say, hey, this is not in my my code path, and I'm not going to update the dependency. And I've seen companies having 1,400 CVs not updated for 7-8 years, just because they claim, and we have no way of knowing for a fact, but that those dependencies that were often open source dependencies were not in the code path and not exploitable, allegedly.
right. Technically, I mean, if that's actually true, if it truly isn't in the code path, they're right. And in fact, I think we do have to be careful of, hey, let's constantly update within 2 minutes whenever there's a
Right.
vulnerable. That's not reasonable. Okay.
But what about 8 years? I mean, do you still, if it's not in the code path, do you still never update it? I mean, that sounds like
No, no, I think that's a terrible idea, though for security, though for two slightly different reasons. First of all, I'm glad the way you asked that question because hey, they think it's not in their code path. The reality is
maybe.
that it may very well be right. Static analysis tools, for example, typically can't notice on dynamically generated linkages and connections. And a lot of software, I mean, it depends on your infrastructure, but for example, Java's notorious for a lot
Right.
of runtime and runtime analysis, and then you make the call. And so a lot of tools won't notice things that are being called, but you don't think they're being called.
Yeah,
Dynamic
or the CV gets you a foothold in the container, and then you can use that one to move to that one, and so it's very if when you have
That's right.
1,400 CVEs, it's almost impossible to know, right, which one is going to do what and whether there's a compounded set of effects you're going to
That's right.
have in your system. So
That's right. That's right. So first of all, you really can't be that confident in your analysis. I mean, it's not bad to use that as a prioritization scheme, but
right,
that's just
right,
a prioritization scheme. The other problem is even if it's not exploitable today, if you're using version 1.0 and the current version is 12.6, if a vulnerability is found in 12.6, you almost certainly can't update to 12.7. Okay.
right.
So leaving really, really old, vulnerable versions of code, especially in the runtime, so when it's actually being deployed, is basically setting yourself up for being unable to respond. And really, it's about responsiveness. It's about resilience. It's about responsiveness. Now, how do you deal with this? Now, the solution, frankly, is planning ahead. There's no miracle, but it's actually pretty remarkable. If you use package managers, so you're not trying to manually copy packet code in. If you're doing manual copying in, you're already doing it wrong. Okay, that's not when there's only a one file of code in your system that you need to deal with that way, that's fine. But as soon as you start dealing with hundreds and thousands, that's ridiculous. You need to automate. Second, you need to have an automated test suite. How good does it have to be? And the answer, I've taken courses on testing, but I think there's a simple answer, much simpler, more direct answer. If I can test it and be confident and it passes and I can be confident to ship, then my test suite's good enough.
Right.
And that needs to be a fully automated test suite. Don't care about the manual test suite. Now, a manual test suite,
Mm-hmm.
manual is just another word for unused. Okay, nobody can repeat manual testing at the scale that we need to in modern software. So automated tests, automated management of the packages of those dependencies, and now I'm getting reports. I can update. I can get a result within a half hour that says yes, it passed my 3,000 tests. I can ship. I can go ship. Now suddenly we're because we have prepared ahead of time, because we know there's going to be vulnerabilities found in our dependencies. We don't know where they are, but we know it's going to happen, and we're prepared for it, and we can respond faster than the adversary.
Here we go. That's a good first step. So now let's dig a little bit into the supply chain security.
Sure.
What is different when you think of supply chain security, and why does it even matter?
Okay. You'll find some variations in definitions, and I'm not going to try to dance on the head of the pin of some of the variations, but I think a whole lot of us became aware during COVID of supply chain issues with things like suddenly items like toilet paper disappeared off the shelf, and we suddenly, if things that we didn't think about suddenly we became very, very aware of. Software is no different in that grand sense from anything else. Nobody today, well, with some exceptions, but in general, software is not built completely all by itself. In general, software is mostly other people's software. If you opened up a physical component, you'll find that the manufacturer of the device did not make the screws, probably didn't make the transistors, probably didn't make, what did they do? They went out to other specialists who made those components, who and then went out to other specialists. And the same thing has happened with software. Software is fundamentally mostly other people's components, and that is a supply chain. The components that you bring in from other sources are a supply chain in software. Now, unfortunately, that supply chain, the good thing about that supply chain is it makes our software able to build software that's amazingly powerful with relatively few resources. The downside is because it's reused, if there's a vulnerability in it, and then those vulnerabilities may be exploitable in the larger system they're in. Another challenge is that it's not just the unintentional vulnerabilities in the components, it's that the processes that those components use to develop and distribute can in fact be attacked. So all those things, the attack of those supply chains, so that attackers may, for example, try to subvert the software that you intend to use between when they released it and you received it, or maybe during its build process, and so on. So supply chain security is basically all that chain backwards through all your dependencies transitively, all the way back. And you'll see some variations on what's in and what's out from various definitions. But I'm going to take a broader definition, primarily because I don't care so much about the definition. What I want to do is prevent the problems, or at least make them much less likely to have an impact.
And so why does it matter for teams to start thinking about this now? It became obviously something we think about after the president executive order on SBOM, but why should have people already paid attention to all of this stuff?
Two answers. One I've already alluded at several times earlier, which is increasingly software is mostly other people's components. So increasingly, most of your vulnerabilities aren't in the software you wrote, but in the components that you brought in. But there's actually an interesting transition that we're starting to see. If you look at supply chain attacks, they have radically increased. Sonatype did a study where they found that, I think it was last year, they increased by 650% or something like that. So they've dramatically increased. Now, why is that? That's an interesting question. The proof's not in yet. The European Union did a study where they also found that, wow, the number of supply chain attacks really dramatically increased over the last couple of years. And after analyzing the evidence that they had, they came up with a hypothesis that I think is the right one. And that is, we are finally starting to see cases where the software being developed is more secure than it used to be. That's not to say that's perfect. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. Nobody's saying that. But the good news is, while there's a lot to do in terms of education, There's a lot to do in terms of tool use. There are increasingly developers who are learning. There are increasingly developers using things like tools to find vulnerabilities in the custom code that they write. And so as a result, attackers are always looking for what's the cost benefit for them. What's the easiest way for them to get their bad things happening? And increasingly, what they're finding is that instead of attacking directly the development or the operations of a system, it's often easier to attack upstream at the software that's going to eventually be brought into those components. And so there's a good news, bad news story. The good news is we're starting to get improvements. The bad news is that the attackers are starting to work backwards. They are also shifting left. But that's okay. We can do that too.
Yeah. So, everybody talk about shift left all the time, and I was, a big proponent of it in DoD. But you're saying so effectively we're still always behind the attackers, right? We always try to be better, but they're always a step ahead, pretty much, huh?
I'm not sure if it's a step ahead. In fact, I would say that the attackers we are pressuring the attackers to do something that historically they wouldn't have done because, I'd rather just, if I'm an attacker, I want to attack the production system that I really cared about. Oh, wait, the defenders are starting to make that harder. Not in all cases. There's a vast amount of software that's really painfully bad in terms of security. But some of the systems that the attackers really want to subvert are starting to get better. Hooray for that. We need more of that. But the shifting left of the defenders is good. Okay. And that has forced the attackers to shift left also because they have to basically shift left of the defenders. But that's okay. We as defenders can keep shifting left ourselves until they run out and until basically the attackers start running out of left, as it were. Because there are bottom turtles in all this. This isn't just hey, the game continues forever. I mean, in one sense, of course, it does. Attackers will continue to always look for ways to break in, but the more we can make it more difficult, less likely, less impact when they do succeed, the harder we make their jobs. And eventually some will drop out of the game, but we've got a ways to go before we get to that point.
So you mentioned the fact that, attackers are targeting now, the DevSecOps pipelines and the source code repos and trying to get into the left side of the pie, I guess. And,
yes.
And so you've seen it with SolarWinds and many other attacks recently, right?
Yes, indeed. SolarWinds was a wake-up call for a lot of folks.
Yeah, no doubt. And what I guess, and the fact that it took forever to find out also is pretty scary, right?
Right. Should we explain what that is? Or does everyone know what that is?
Yeah, you bring, give us some context, I guess.
Yeah. So I hate to interrupt your question, but you raised something that I'm not sure everybody in this audience will know. SolarWinds is a product widely used called Orion. Used to monitor lots and lots of organizations, and unfortunately, an attacker managed to subvert what's called the build process of Orion. For those of you who aren't familiar with software developers typically write their software often as text, but that's not what you actually run as a customer. There has to be a process to turn what the developers type into something that can actually be installed and used, and that process is called a build process. When the attackers subverted the build process, this meant that the developers were seeing one thing and reviewing it and so on, but that wasn't what was getting shipped to the end users. And for a lot of folks, this was a big wake-up call because this was not something that a lot of folks were looking for or concerned about. There are countermeasures, but the first step is acknowledging that, wait a minute, the attackers aren't just attacking the operational systems. They are attacking the processes used to develop it. They're attacking the processes used to develop components brought in. And again, the attackers are shifting left, and so we've got to also shift our defense. We need to have our defenses shifting further left too.
Yeah, and so it's important for people to realize they did not tamper with the source code; they tampered with the build server.
That's right.
That ended up injecting malicious code into the the software and then being shipped to the customer. And by hacking one company, they ended up hacking 100,000.
Right.
And so that's obviously, back to your point on the best outcome for the hackers and the least amount of work. That's a better way to think about it. So when you think of these attacks, what keeps you up at night specifically when it comes to that shift left and what we need to start thinking about?
Oh boy. I mean, there's a long list of things to be concerned about. But I think the good news is that we are starting on that journey. I mean, the reality is that everyone who develops every single one of these components, we need to basically up our game in terms of making sure everybody knows how to develop secure software, starts putting tools in. Right now, very much looking for the unintentional vulnerabilities is a key part of that. I've been encouraging the use of multi-factor authentications. Where so that basically because one of the things that hackers want to do is take over a developer's account and then insert a subversion that way. So that counters a lot of those kinds of attacks. The good news is that each one of these things are not rocket science. They're using technologies already available. And so in I think right now we've been focusing primarily on removing unintentional vulnerabilities from operations, move backwards a little bit. Let's get more tools in them, more education. Let's counter the subversion of developer accounts. In the longer term, I do worry about malicious developers as well and malicious builds. But the good news is that in both cases, there are solutions for this. For the subverted builds, there are techniques like reproducible builds that can actually detect that kind of problem. And for malicious developers, the best technique anybody knows is having multiple reviewers, having other people looking at the software. Hey, you just inserted some code that tries to execute some encrypted data. That's probably a bad idea. What's going on here? and and so really, it's the good news is that there are known techniques to deal with these things. The trick is putting these known techniques, well, first of all, making them known to the people who need to know them and then getting them into practice.
Yeah, no doubt. And all the principle of GitOps and DevSecOps, when you start thinking multiple set of eyes on approval, and then no drift between the production environment and the development side, and making sure there's a full ability to map what's running in runtime with what's in the code, and that there's no drift, is all kind of great mitigation capabilities to mitigate at least some of these attacks, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So Kristen was mentioning that a lot of people probably know more about Log4j, the recent vulnerability. Maybe you can give us also a quick rundown of Log4j and what it is.
Okay, now I'm going to be separating things a little bit. Log4j is not a vulnerability; it's just a widely used component. The vulnerability that a lot of people are talking about is something called Log4Shell, which is a particular kind or set of vulnerabilities in Log4j, which is a very, very widely used component. In this particular case, really, there's something like 10 maintainers. I mean, it's not a, it's a component that is, widely used. It has a number of folks who support it, maintain it. But in this particular case, really,
and it's a log component on Java, right?
That's right. It basically performs logging for Java-based systems. So, modern systems, very complicated. How do you debug it? And the answer fundamentally is, as you run software, increasingly people log, here's what happened, here's what happened, so that when there's a problem, you can go back and figure out what happened. There's nothing wrong with using a logging component. Many systems do. The problem is that Log4j had a vulnerability in it. If you logged something in a certain format, all of a sudden it would download and install and run software from the internet from a location of the attacker's decision, which is a terrible, terrible, terrible idea.
And it's Log4j is a library, right? So
yes.
so thousands of applications were using it. It wasn't just one company.
That's right. And really one of the big challenges, I imagine we'll want to talk about SBOMs in a moment, is that most users of Log4j weren't necessarily even aware that they were using Log4j.
Right.
Because modern software, it's not just, hey, I want to bring in one component. I may bring in 10 components, but each of those components brings in 10 more components, which brings in 10 more components. I mean, it's not at all unusual to start with a so-called empty application and discover you have 700 or 1,000 dependencies directly or indirectly brought in. Simply because of this transitive nature of I bring in something, it brings in something, it brings in something. And this is the same true. This is the same as true, by the way, for physical software physical supply chains as well. I mean, you bring in a component that brings in another component from somewhere, which brings in a component from somewhere. But because all of that ends up within the software that you're actually running, it's quite possible for you to depend on a component, but be unaware that you're using that component. And for a recipient of the software may have no idea whether or not, it's, and by the way, the same problem happened with Heartbleed, which is a vulnerability in OpenSSL. There were a lot of systems that used OpenSSL, but not only did the people deploying those systems not know, often the folks delivering the systems didn't know either. It was transitively included through multiple levels. The solution to that really is there's been an increased interest in something called SBOMs, software bill of materials, so that when there's a major critical vulnerability, that organizations can not just ask the question, gee, this is a really big bad vulnerability. Where in our organization do we use it? They'd like to be able to answer that question without people having to try to work nights and weekends over holidays trying to write specialized code, which is in fact what happened with the Log4Shell vulnerability. People ended up trying to write all sorts of weird specialized code to look for something, and that doesn't really make sense long term. It'd be much better to say, oh, I will push this button and I get the answer.
Yeah, no doubt. So there was an interesting event, right, at the White House with the Open Source Summit. Tell us a little bit of what happened and why this matters.
Sure. Well, in fact, talking about the Log4Shell, Log4Shell vulnerability in Log4j is actually a good segue to this. Um, the I mean, the U.S. government, like all governments, uses a lot of open source software, and the U.S. Government's quite well aware of that. You mentioned earlier the U.S. Department of Defense has had a policy on open source software for many years because the DoD, like everybody else, uses lots of open source software. However, Log4j made a lot of people worry. All of a sudden, U.S. government was trying to find all the uses of Log4j, figure out which cases were vulnerable, which cases were exploitable in their context, and this is incredibly difficult to do. And so it's so they brought in the open source, basically wanted to have a meeting with various folks, and so they called a meeting and asked various organizations, including the Linux Foundation, including many others, and they said, hey, um, we are using a lot of this open source software and this bad thing happened. We're not trying to stop using all open source software. That's not a reasonable goal, but we can clearly, it will be good to find a way to do things better somehow. And I think that's actually the right thing to do. Whenever there's a big problem, bring folks together who understand it and ask, hey, what can be done to do better next time? That's a reasonable thing to do. Most of the organizations in the room, by the way, I was actually one of the attendees. Well, and I say room only in a virtual sense. It was actually a electronic call because COVID.
You didn't even get
Uh,
to go to the White House. That's sad.
did not get to go to the White House. They originally were trying to do as a physical meeting, and that just it that that just didn't work out. But that's okay. Still had a meeting anyway. And most of them basically said, we agree. This is an important issue. We actually formed this organization called the Open Source Security Foundation last year, actually year before, and then made some changes. And so they pointed to the OpenSSF and saying, hey, we are already very concerned about improving the security of open source software. Here's where most of the work is going on. Please get involved. Give us information on what the needs are, and and so basically, uh, there were several outcomes of that, but one was basically a number of folks, including me, went off to say, okay, what can we learn from this experience? And I don't remember the exact date, but not that long ago came out with something called the Open Source Mobilization Plan, which tried to say, okay, we're already doing a lot. What additional things can we do to improve the security of open source software even further? And we're basically talking with other folks, is this the right set of things to do? And for the things which people do seem to agree it's the right thing to do, trying to stand up for his groups and organizations to go work on those things, because we want, the bad things are bad things, but there's always the opportunity to learn and do better to prevent the worst the next time. And that's very much the goal here. And the good news is that things like the mobilization plan and so on, they're not really, although they help the U.S. government, I'm sure, they're not specific to the U.S. or U.S. government at all. Everybody around the world uses open source software. Everybody depends on the security of software, including open source software. So it's in everybody's interests, except for the attackers, to to make
Although
things
they also
better.
use open source, I guess. So,
I'm sorry.
but although they also use open source software too, but
Absolutely, they indeed they do. Well, we can talk more about that, but yeah, the good news is we've identified some things that we're working on. For example, things like increasing education. That's still a big problem, and something I'll keep banging the drum on, because still today most software developers don't really learn very much about how to develop secure software. It's not an expectation in courses at universities and colleges. It's not something most boot camps cover. If you're self-taught, you're unlikely to see that in material either. And so, it's a problem, and it's something that we're actively working to make better.
and Mike was saying, if open source usage is so ubiquitous, it affects both the public and the private sector. Why wouldn't the federal government spend more money to fund it?
An excellent question, and in fact, the federal government is itself asking that question. There are actually bills and proposed bills in discussion to fund it more. It's a lot of the same. A lot of people have noted, and I think rightly, that software, particularly open source software, is a kind of infrastructure. It's and it has the tragedy of the commons problem, where I want somebody else to spend the effort, not me, uh, and that's perfectly understandable. So I think the honest answer to that question is that software, unlike roads, is a lot more invisible. I have a double E degree, and one of the cool things about electronics is that you can bring up and show people little circuit boards and chips and physical things you can hand it around a room. Software is notoriously invisible. A lot of folks don't really think about it, and so it's been much harder to, even though it has a serious effect when things go wrong, it's often been hard to point out. Also, I think in the past, there's just been less awareness within governments about software. I think that has changed significantly. Um, I remember, and I hope I'll omit the name, and they'll figure it out. But I was pleasantly surprised when we went to the White House, talked to various folks, and of course, obviously, lots of people with many different backgrounds and knowledge. But I sat down with one of the folks that's supporting the effort to improve, looking at improving the security of open source software and what can the U.S. government do, and it turned out, oh wait, this individual used to be the lead of the Chrome security team. Oh, I don't have to explain to you what a build process is, okay? Over time, many years ago, the knowledge about software within government was relatively small. I won't claim that it's universal or anything like that, but I think it's gotten better. So I think that yes, it hasn't gotten the attention it probably deserved, but the good news is I think it is starting to get that attention. Now, attention is not always the same as funding. I'm well aware of that. But nevertheless, I think that there's interest in it, and I have hopes that that interest can turn into useful action. I think there's reasons to be hopeful.
Well, look, they even put a French guy as the first chief software officer in the DoD, so I guess there's something going on somewhere. I don't know. So, all right, let's look into our dear friend SBOM. Tell us a little bit about what it is exactly and the value it brings to the table.
Okay. Actually, if you don't mind, I see a question from one of the people. If you don't mind if I want to quickly answer that
Sure.
before
Which
I
one is
forget
it?
that. Yeah, the question was, hey, you can't teach something that's constantly changing. It's true that you can't teach something if it constantly changes, but this doesn't constantly change.
Right.
The number one kinds of vulnerabilities, if you look at if you look at, for example, what are the number one kinds of vulnerabilities from Microsoft for the last 12 years, or Chrome, is basically memory safety issues, buffer overflows, overreads, overwrites, and use after freeze and such. Occasionally a double free. Buffer overflows were talked about and discussed as a security issue in the 1970s. Okay,
Right.
They're not changing. One of the most common kinds of vulnerabilities in web applications is SQL injection. It was that way last year. It was that way 10 years ago. While it's true that some things change, the reality is that the stuff that are key problems in security, how do you design software? How do you design software for security has been known since the 1970s. Not by developers, but the principles have been known since the 1970s. We just don't teach developers what they are, so they remain a mystery to them. We don't tell the developers.
Is it a training? Is it a training issue? I mean, what is
It's
it?
a training and education issue, number one. It's also a lack of tooling, lack of review for those things. But the tools aren't really helpful unless you know what you're looking for. The reviews are useless unless the reviews know what you're looking for. So I start with training simply because that's step one. That's not the last step, but it's the first step. And so, no, the fundamental issues for security have been the same for at least 50 years, mostly. Sure, some small changes have occurred over the years, but that's fine. We need to learn, we need to improve. But most of the stuff is the same old stuff, but we're not teaching our developers, we're not taking any steps to counter them, and so they continue to be the same old problems. Okay, now answer your question. What are SBOMs? Why do they matter? So SBOM just stands for Software Bill of Material. The usual analogy is it's an ingredient list. You pick up a box of cereal, you look on the side, you can find out what's in it. If you're allergic to one of those things, or maybe you have a religious belief where I will not accept certain things, you can say, oh wait, no, I don't want to eat that because X, Y, or Z. Okay. SBOMs let you do the same sort of thing. They let me ask the question, what's in there? And then I can ask the question, is that something I want to ingest? Oh, it's got a log4j version XYZ. That's the vulnerable version. Why do you have the vulnerable version there? That may be a vulnerability that's exploitable. And even if not, that suggests to me a lack of duty of care. You're not looking what's in there and making sure things are up to date. I'm now reasonably concerned. And it's not just, hey, I have a vague concern. I have specific evidence that I either should or shouldn't be concerned about something. So that's what an SBOM does. Now, why does it matter? Because software is mostly other people's software, that means that a lot of the vulnerabilities are in other people's software. And so finding out what's in there can give you a lot of insight. It can tell you about both the known vulnerabilities and also there's a lot of really obsolete software in there. That suggests that when a vulnerability is found, they won't be able to respond in a reasonable time. Upgrading from 12.6 to 12.7, they can probably do quickly. I don't know anything about their development processes, but there's no miracle that will let them update from 1 to 12.7. So, so basically, while it doesn't tell you everything, when you're trying to make risk management decisions, and really that's what most of these decisions come down to. I want to make risk management decisions where I can't avoid all risks, but I can determine this is much riskier, this is much less risky. The odds of a problem are lower, the odds of an impact, the impact if it happens is lower, and therefore I'm going to go in this direction. And so SBOMs provide information that we haven't had before about the software that has become important now because software is so much other people's software.
And so when you think of SBOMs, right, providing the kind of the list of dependencies and what's being used and the vulnerabilities of these, and so giving you kind of a risk posture of the software and the dependencies inside of that software. When you look also at the other side of the risk, which is who is behind the packages and who is behind some of that open source community. Particularly for us, I guess in DoD, we think about foreign actors being the only contributor to an open source project. I've yet to see a lot of work being done on SBOM when it comes to provenance and who are the contributors, the diversity of contributors. Are we relying on one dude in his garage?
Right.
Is there work on SBOM stuff to start thinking of that kind of stuff?
I think that I guess I can answer that yes and no. So I think we have to be careful that SBOMs are not the solution for all things. Okay,
right.
If
it's
they
not a
are
full
a
risk posture, you mean?
they do not solve all. What they do is they provide you information so you can take the next step. Okay, you mentioned
How do you know the bill of material? I mean, if you don't know who made the material you're listing, how is that a good enough representation of the materials if you don't know who made it?
Actually, in a vast number of cases, you don't care, because if I know that I've got log4j version X and it's hideously old, actually you can find out
But what
a
about
lot about.
smaller projects, right? I mean,
Right,
not the big ones.
but let me finish this
Yeah.
thought though. In a vast number of cases, it's not so much that you care about exactly who. The problem is that there are known vulnerabilities in old versions, or it's just really old, and so it's unlikely to be updated. And you don't need to delve deeply into provenance to answer that question.
Right.
And right now, today, that's perceived as the much bigger issue is simply the, it doesn't matter that there's an up-to-date version that doesn't have vulnerabilities. You're not using that version. So since that right now is the primary problem that people are seeing, let's focus on the primary problem. And SBOMs generally only tell you, here are the components, here are the version numbers, and then you can do it. And when you receive that, now you can do an analysis. You can analyze things like, well, what are the known vulnerabilities of that? If you want to go further and ask about the project, you can do so. Frankly, my first step wouldn't be so much the exactly who. Is this a one person project, or there are lots of contributors? It's a lively project. There are multiple people doing reviews, and that sort of thing. You can very, very quickly figure out without trying to delve into nationalities and so on and so forth.
No, yeah, that's what I mean. Like volume of people and
Right,
contribution.
and you can absolutely do that. There are tools that will say, hey,
But it's
given
not in
this,
the SBOM process, right?
it's the SBOM itself is simply an ingredient list, and just like a cereal, you would not expect a cereal box side to say, oh, here's the name of the chemical. Let me show you the diagram of the chemical, and let me
No, but they tell you what the factor is.
Well, they may or may not tell you where the factory is, but they're going to give you the name of well, not necessarily in cereal boxes.
I can tell you it's mandated by law in the United States to show where the product was made and packaged.
Right. But my point here for software, the point though is that we want to identify the component And now you can go back and answer those other questions, because those other questions are much easier to answer once you know what the component
Sure.
is. And that's really basically, it lets you link I have a product, there is information out there in the world. How do I figure out how to connect those two? And so
Right.
basically the SBOM provides the link, but you then have to take that SBOM data and do the analysis. And there's a lot of folks who are looking at, who are not looking at, have tools to do that analysis. But there's a chicken and egg problem. It's hard to encourage the use of those tools without data to use them. And it's hard to encourage people to provide this data without tools to analyze them. And so the U.S. government and some others are very much trying to kickstart that problem, so that there'll be SBOMs so that they can be analyzed, to encourage more people to generate SBOMs, to encourage improvements in tools all the way around.
Interesting. All right, so we talked about SBOM. Tell us a little bit about the work being done by the Linux Foundation on SPDX.
Okay, so SBDX is a standard format for exchanging SBOM data. And it's been at work for quite some time. And you know, earlier we finally got it is an official ISO standard. So for a lot more governments, that's a really big deal. They want to make sure there's an internet, it is an official international standard. SPDX does a number of interesting things. So let me just kind of point out. Um, Historically, there's many reasons to ask, what ingredients are in the software. Two of the main reasons to ask these questions are for legal questions and for security questions. Historically, a lot of folks really wanted to know what the components were for legal questions. They wanted to know whether or not, I'm about to do a merger acquisition. What are the components in here? Is there a legal issue that we should be concerned about? Um, and so therefore, there are tools. Basically, you need tools to analyze and report this, but how do you report that? You need a standard way to report this information, this SBOM information. And SPDX it basically lets you specify, here are the components, and transitively, so here's component X includes component Y, and information about those components, including things like licensing information. A lot of folks know about SPDX not for the broader SPDX format to tell you about the SBOM, but just for what's called the license expression, because it has a very simple way to express the license of a particular component. And for a lot of folks, even just that portion of SPDX is really, really helpful. And so SPDX, it's been in work for a while. There's a version now that's got an official ISO standardization, and they're currently at that's 2.2 is out, and they're currently working on various extensions, improvements to reduce a version 3, which is currently ongoing, and love people to to know more. Yes, many organizations are using Sql Injection, which is a competing format. Sql Injection is actually mentioned in the mobilization plan. And so this is a challenge here. Unfortunately, we are having a standards war, which is never any fun. And that's kind of unfortunate.
Do you
So
think there is a need to support both effectively and just be agnostic?
I certainly, that's the way the U.S. government has gone, and I think for a lot of folks that's going to be where we're going to move, at least in the short term. So I think that's it's unfortunate that we've decided to have a format war, but since there is a format war, I'm much more interested in getting the SBOM data. Now and then getting, and then trying to go from there. And I think we're probably for at least some time going to be seeing use of both of those formats. There's actually a third format, SWID, some folks are using. It really wasn't intended for the kind of SBOM, particularly for open source components, which is the majority of components. So I think it's really down to those two. But some folks don't agree, and that's fine. Now, there was
Oh, very
another
good.
question that folks that was asked before that one, and I've lost it now.
Yeah.
Do you?
I flagged a few. You know, we'll wait a little bit.
Okay.
I want to make sure we don't completely go off track. There's so many, but and you don't even see all of them. So
Okay.
there's Twitter also. So here we go. So let's see what else we got after this. Oh, here we go. So when you think of SBOM and the adoption of SBOM, what are the challenges for open source projects to start doing their own SBOM so then people can consume that so based on their dependencies, right?
I think the quick answer is we need better tooling. We need very good open source tools for generating SBOMs. I do remember what one of the questions was earlier. It was about the challenges of figuring out materials after the fact when you receive, say, an in package. I think that there is a use case for such tools, but those are when all else fails and you're in a bad situation, here's the best you can make of a bad situation. If you're in the bad situation, I mean, you do what you can. But that is not the long term, I think, that we need to do. The basic answer to the how do we generate SBOMs is during build processes, because that's when the most information is available. Very
Right.
much, if I can continue the analogy, if I receive some cereal and I want to know what the components are, I could use various kinds of chemical analysis to try to figure out what's in it. That turns out to be really hard. Okay, I don't know
Yeah.
especially those who are familiar with organic chemistry will realize that's incredibly difficult. But wait a minute, if you're the maker of the cereal, you know that grains are going in, sugar's going in, this color is going in. It's much easier when you're building, when you're generating, when you're in the factory to figure out what components are going in. And so, really, that's where it needs to happen. So, one challenge is we need to improve the tooling to make this super easy to do during generation. Another problem is, frankly, um, we're asking developers to do something that helps the end users, not the developers themselves. Usually, it's much easier to convince a developer to do something if it helps that developer. But in fact, this is something that is desired downstream. Um, I don't think that's a disaster because most developers really do want to help other people using the software that they've developed. But we've got to make it easy, easy, easy. And I think I'll go for, I'm going to step a little further, but I don't think it's a terribly strong step. Basically, we need tools that can be easily used in generation, and we need good open source. In particular, we need good open source tools, because if we expect people to spend lots and lots of money to buy products to generate these SBOMs within open source software projects, I don't think that that's a likely winning game. Now, I do think there is a role for proprietary software for doing heuristic analysis after the fact. Here's a blob, go figure it out. That's really hard to do. So I could see a field for, but I think that we need to use those only in the worst possible case, because it's so hard to do. The results are often extremely limited. They're often wrong in certain ways. They have huge emissions. And it's not because software developers are terrible. It's just because you're asking someone to do an incredibly difficult problem, and a lot of heuristics are necessary to even try.
So free is probably important, right, for
Yep.
open source specifically, and then when you compare that to the commercial products, right, that also
Okay,
use
let me stop
themselves
you right
open
there,
source.
because you work for the DoD. If you look at the DoD open source software policy,
Yeah.
you'll note that COTS and commercial software includes open source software. If it is licensed to the public, and it has a non-government use, it is automatically commercial software. So pretty much all open source software is always commercial software, and if it exists already, it's already COTS. But I know what you mean. What you mean is
Yeah.
proprietary software. And are there challenges for proprietary software? Are there challenges for open source software? I think the answer is yes. In both cases, basically it's the tooling. We need to make the tools easier to use. Really for all cases, the proprietary folks have the same problem. There's a cost benefit
Well,
issue for
they have
them
a little
too.
bit more money, but yeah.
They have more money, but they also have the challenge that they, like all software developers, they're trying to get something done. Okay,
Right.
and
Yeah.
there's limited resources, and so on. And not all proprietary folks have a lot of money, and not all open source software has no money. So it's a much more complicated than that.
Right.
Now, as far as the challenge, that's one challenge. I think there is an additional challenge that the proprietary software developers work with. And that is a lot, not all, but many proprietary software vendors do not want to reveal the software that they use within their components. I can be a little sympathetic, I guess, but the reality is, if you thought that was your secret sauce, you're going to be disappointed when you find out all the people who can analyze the software and figure it out anyway. Um,
Right.
I
That
think
doesn't
that's
fly anymore, does it?
I don't think that flies very well. I think that's I mean, if it's a
I had a
service
lot of
only.
that with a container on Iron Bank in DoD. A lot of people saying my secret sauce. You're gonna show my secret sauce.
Yeah, I think it'll be there are things called secret sauce, but if the secret sauce is publicly available software that anybody can get, uh, let me tell you something. It's not very secret. Okay?
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think that's a social challenge. It's not a technical challenge. It's a misunderstanding of thinking something is their secret sauce when it frankly isn't. It never was. But they're so used to thinking of everything as being special that they don't
Yeah.
realize you're actually, frankly, not so special. So I think
Right.
that's one
Right.
one of the other challenges for them. Now, I think one of the other challenges, and this is really not just proprietary, is the first time you generate an SBOM, you will probably discover things you don't like. And then you'll say, gee, I'm going to tell my customer all these horrible things. Say, well, to start with, yes, but maybe that additional insight will give you reasons to fix those problems. Because wait a minute, I can see that some of my components are many, many years out of date. Well, time to fix that, and that's okay. That first step to fixing a problem is knowing you have one.
Here we go. Interesting. All right. So we talk about COTS. We got and open source, I guess. But I get what you mean. So when you think of the SBOM, right? How deep would you have to think about SBOM when it comes to dependencies? Is it endless? And like you said, you end up with 1,000 dependencies as recursive and infinite to some
Well,
degree.
thankfully, there is going to be no infinity because eventually there will be. I mean,
Yeah, at some
there's
point you're
not an
gonna get
infinite
to the
number,
end of it.
right?
Yeah.
Presumably, your software isn't of infinite size. There's going to be a finite number
Right.
of components in there.
Yeah.
Now maybe
Although they keep
some.
adding more stuff, and you could make it, each project could add more shit, and it's just endless, right? But
Oh,
yeah.
well, it is endless but finite.
Yep.
Endless in a social sense, but it really is
Evolution way.
finite.
Yeah.
Right. It
Yeah.
really is finite, and that's a good thing. How deep? Um, really, I think the question becomes, what is the purpose? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that from the point of view of a customer, okay, what they really want is enough information to be able to answer important questions. What customers need is enough information to answer two questions. There's at least two. There's probably two other use cases, but there's two in particular from a customer's use case perspective. One is, I'm thinking about using this software, or I am using this software. What is my risk? Okay. You really need to know all the dependencies transitively. Now, maybe the deliverer only needs to give just enough so that the receiver can figure out the rest. They're asking a lot of every recipient. Why not just figure it out once and be done with it? Okay, so I think you ought to go recursive transitively all the way down. If you really don't want to, and no, you don't have to embed that data within the executable. Okay, posting it on a website somewhere is fine. Okay, uh, but making it available all the way down transitively is best from the point of view of the consumer. The second use case is, oh my gosh, there's a really bad vulnerability in a component. Where is it? And again, if I receive transitive information all the way down as a customer, I can rapidly analyze that data. Could I refigure it out without that transitive data? Yes, as long as you give me enough where all the bottoms are publicly known. But it's much better and more accurate if you provide the transitive data all the way down. Because if you don't provide the transitive data all the way down, you can often estimate them, but those estimates are sometimes wrong. And so it's much, much better if the SBOM is complete. Understand the licensing attached to open source as well. Right. I'm focusing on the security. This is actually one of the distinctions. I mean, Spdx is very interested in both the licensing and the security aspects of it. I'm not really excited. I know that some people have argued that, hey, we ought to have a format that talks about security, and then we'll have a different list of a different SBOM listing the components for licensing. I don't understand that argument. It's the same components. If you have
No, I agree.
something listed two different ways, the one thing I'm sure of is they'll be inconsistent, and I won't be able to figure out which one's right. So
Yep.
I do agree the licensing is important. SPDX in particular has been very, very interested in this. And there's multiple reasons to want to know about the licensing. If you are doing M&A, obviously you care about that of software you're acquiring. But when you're reusing, you want to make sure you comply with the license conditions. A lot of software today incorporates lots of open source software, and that's okay. But then you need to make sure that you comply with all the licenses that you're required to comply with. Um, Thankfully, most people end up using a relatively short list of licenses. So once you identify that short list, you're usually in pretty good shape. But that's you need to get to that point.
Yeah, and this is kind of the same argument I used as to why I believe we should have also more insights when it comes to provenance. And by provenance, I mean not just the name of the I'm not talking about the name of the contributors, but more like the volume, the number, and probably now that I think about it, even like where is the software being built? Just like the factory of a cereal is on the box to track potential contamination of the factory, and need to recall maybe a bunch of boxes because they were contaminated by some disease or whatever. There is back to the point on the SolarWind issue.
Right.
It might be good sometimes to even be tracking where the build came from. So I mean,
Right. Now,
obviously it's a maturity thing, but
yeah, actually, there's actually an ongoing discussion and some debates about this. There's absolutely work that's going along these lines. I would be remiss if I don't mention a couple projects. One of them is Salsa, which is working to spec out some of these things. How do I about how do I get this software? How is it built? There's other techniques like there's Tough and in Toto, which
yeah,
try to record this. There's actually a little bit of a philosophical debate about builds. So let me give you both sides. I do have a viewpoint on this. One is we want to identify where we build it and protect the heck out of it. Google very much works in this camp, and there's good reasons for that. They spent an incredible amount of money. I mean, they actually source boards, rebuild their own hardware, for their own data set, control their own data centers. I mean, they spend an incredible amount of money to get really, really strong confidence in the hardware and software used to build other software.
right,
I respect those kinds of efforts, and certainly I would agree protecting your build environments and is a good thing. However, I think most organizations just can't afford that kind of stuff, and of course, there is a risk that even if you do all that, how are you absolutely sure that everything's okay? Because once they get in, it's often very hard to notice that they did. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's a lesson learned from SolarWinds is once somebody gets into a build system, it's really hard to detect, and they can just stay there and do damage for a very, very long time if they want to. So I'm actually a believer in the short term, yes, do harden your build environments. In the long term, I think we need to be removing more and more towards an approach called verified reproducible builds. This is
Yeah.
where, um, gee, it was built. There's source code. It was built. How do I know that the code I'm going to be running, the package I'm going to be running, really was generated from that source code? And the answer can be, well, we're going to rerun it multiple times with multiple different organizations and verify that everybody gets the same answer. Once you do that, that means that you aren't as dependent. I mean, yes, you still want secure build environments, but now we have mechanisms to detect even really sneaky attackers. Because if they get in, sure, they'll subvert one, but now they've got to subvert all of them, and you can even check it later, which makes the attacker's job far harder. So in the short term, yes, we absolutely should be improving the protection of our build environments. Good idea. Long term, I think we ought to move increasingly towards verified reproducible builds because this provides us a protection beyond what even very, very secured build systems can do, because now the attacker has to subvert multiple systems in a way that's much, much harder to do, including future systems that aren't even being used yet, because you can retest things later.
Yeah, I'll take both. But so are you saying Google is kind of against the evidence piece of it? Of
No,
like,
no, no. I think against is the wrong term.
yeah, I'll
It's that
agree.
that's not fair at all. In fact, Google's been very supportive of many of these efforts. It's just that uh, today and it's not just Google. I use Google as an example, and they're not the only example. Or just it's because
Sure.
I've had some interactions with them, and they do some really cool stuff. I don't want people come away with, oh, these crazy Google people. That's not the message. Okay.
Well, they
Um,
created most of the stuff we use anyway with Kubernetes and
Right.
stuff.
There's some smart people there. But my point though is that they've been very concerned about build security, and so they've taken really strong steps, and that's
Right.
awesome.
It's
But
kind of anti-zero trust way of thinking, though, right? When you stop thinking that way.
I wouldn't say it's anti, but it's certainly doubling down on I'm gonna have. It's not necessarily wrong. It's a strategy. And if you
Yeah.
have the resources to implement that kind of strategy, maybe that makes sense for their organization. But what concerns me isn't so much that Google's doing it. Go for it. Okay, it's just that I don't think
Yeah.
many other
Not everyone
organizations,
can.
not everyone can reproduce that particular approach. And so I think that there's nothing wrong with the improved security of what they're doing. Keep doing that. But I think longer term, yes, well, if you can harden up your build environments, do that. But in the long term, I think we should move slowly towards verified reproducible builds. Now, the problem with verified reproducible builds is once you get them and start testing them, it's great. But historically, nobody ever tried to do that. And so it's typically effort on the
Yeah.
software developers to make that happen, to make things reproducible. So um, it's this is a North Star that I think we should move towards eventually. It's going to take time. So work on the securing the build environments right now. You can do at least some of that right now today. And then let's slowly build towards that larger future. That's going to take time to get there. And you need to start there to get there, but you also need to not depend on it right away because we're not ready for that today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have one more question before we get to the audience questions, and then we only have 10 minutes left. But so when you think about the provenance in the sense of the number of stalls or the last commits or the number of people reviewing code and all these kind of health, I call it health, but I don't know how you want to describe it, but like a healthy
Measures of
vibrant,
risk.
yeah, the kind of a vibrant project versus like a one guy in the garage, right, kind of thing.
Uh-huh,
Are you tracking any kind of work being done by any kind of open source project that will give you some type of a rank or some type of an idea of the open source community behind a project?
Absolutely. Okay, so let me point to a couple here because there are different approaches to dealing with this, and therefore, right now, it's not at all obvious that any one of them is the right answer anyway. So we've got several. So first of all, I mentioned earlier the OpenSSF best practices badge work. If you are developing an open source project, please work to get a badge. We've got thousands of participating projects, and a number of people have received badges of varying levels. Another project is called the Scorecards Project. Now, the best practices badge, what it does is it has a series of questions. Some of them are automated, and we try to automate what we can, but we focus really on what are the important things, even if some of them are very, very hard to automatically check. The Scorecards Project takes the opposite view. Hey, let's just figure out what we can measure automatically and measure what we can. Okay. The good news of the Scorecards Project is that you can apply it to any open source project. Heck, you can apply it to just projects in general and get a score of what is it doing. Now, Scorecards isn't perfect. If, for example, one of the things it wants to look for is there a static analysis tool in use? There may be one and it doesn't notice it. It may say, "Oh, I don't find one," even if there is one. But then that's just kind of the nature of these kinds of tools. The tools are never perfect, but they can give you at least a that it didn't find it. Maybe there is one, but I'm going to have to investigate further, and it'll give me an idea of some risks. I mentioned Salsa, slsa.dev, a good place to go. They're working on a spec, more not for the final delivery. I probably should. Salsa excuse me. Salsa stands for Supply Chain Levels for Software Artifacts. It's basically, it's kind of a checklist about preventing tampering and integrity of packages. There's some other projects too that are working, but those are at least three that come to mind immediately.
That's good enough. All right, let's take a few questions before we leave you the time to give the closing words.
Okay, and we've taken some questions too, thankfully.
Oh yeah. All right, let's start with this one. From your experience, is there any difference from the security perspective between the various open source community edition products and their enterprise edition siblings?
Oh, it's a good question, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to give you the standard lawyer answer, which is it depends.
Yes, it's true though.
Yes, it is absolutely true. I mean, the question is, what's the difference between them? There are community edition projects that are, in fact, the code-wise is the same, and what you're really asking about is a service difference. When you have a problem, what do you see? Okay,
that's less and less, though, right? I mean, most companies now keeping some of the coolest features like ALLBACK and FIPS compliance and things in their paid version, right?
Right. But if it is, the question is, what are those differences, and do they matter from a security perspective?
Usually, funny enough, I usually find them to be mostly cyber things like ALLBACK and ICAM and FIPS compliance crypto bits and
Right. And so the question here is, does that matter for your use case? So unfortunately, there isn't a simple answer. You really, whenever the question, my experience is whenever the question is X better than Y, the answer really is we don't know without going and evaluating X and Y.
Right.
And there's no royal road other than that. That said, usually there's a way to figure out what the difference is, and then at least that gives you a leg up to compare them.
Yeah. Another lawyer answer for you. If the federal government just dumped Windows Desktop and switched to Linux, what percentage of hacks would disappear?
Oh my goodness!
No one has a number. I can tell you, I don't even have the number of being in the government after being in the government. So
and of course, which Windows are we talking? Windows XP,
server,
Windows 95? Are we going all the way to Windows 7? Maybe. I honestly I don't know.
There's also plenty of CVEs on Linux. Let's face it.
Absolutely, absolutely, and the answer for all those things, frankly, I mean, you really need to harden things down when you're deploying anything, not just desktops, but certainly desktops.
And someone made a good point also, like the user experience for people moving from Windows to Linux would probably not be an easy thing overnight for most of the government employees. But
it depends on what they're doing, right?
right.
So I think increasingly folks are, if you're using mainly your web browser and maybe a mail client, you probably won't notice. If you're using a
It's a lot of
specialized
office
app,
work though, right? It's I mean most government work is Word, Excel, right? So
well, it depends on where you are. I think that's historically true. I think increasingly people are starting to move to things like Office 365. In which case it's you're using a web browser. You're not really
yeah,
using
you can do the web version.
the web version. So unfortunately, this is definitely going to be another. It depends. Uh, Clearly, though, I think there is a gradual move off of client side applications for office work. I very rarely nowadays open up any Office suite locally. It's almost always a cloud-based system. So I think
Yeah.
that's what's happening in the commercial space, and as that happens in the federal government, a lot of things are going to slowly change.
All right. So last question before the parting words. I'll give my quick answer, and then it's after over to you after that. But first, have you considered the security rating or evaluation process for large open source projects to give integrator more confidence in using their code?
In fact, we already answered that question. We actually
Right.
have
That's
several
the
the
OpenSSF badge.
best practices badge, the Scorecards Project, Salsa.
Is the
There's
badge OpenSSF? Is that an
Yeah,
OpenSSF
that's the
thing?
OpenSSF badge. I will have to quickly throw a link in.
No, it's fine. I'll find it. Keep talking.
Okay. So look for the OpenSSF best practices badge. Should
Right.
get you there.
I see it.
Historically, that was actually the CII best practices badge.
Yep.
And that's still where the URL is today. I'm going to slip in. I'm going to remove the en because then people will get. Although if English is your primary language, you'll end up with the English version. But yeah, and in fact, that actually gives the broader issue, which an excuse to talk about a broader issue, which is software development is global, not just open source, not just
Yep.
proprietary. It's global, and so folks who want to say, "Hey, I only want to use software that's only written in the U.S. by U.S. cleared personnel," you're going to be very, very disappointed to find out that you can't use anything. So we need to move beyond that. It's a globalized world. We need to manage risks, not try to eliminate all possible risks. The latter is not possible.
There we go. All right. Before I give you the parting words, I'm going to remind everybody to subscribe to the show at the internetofTime.tv, but also next Tuesday, 1 p.m., we're going to have Armand Dadgar, who is the co-founder and CTO of HashiCorp, join us to talk about his journey and the companies and what they've been working on some of the Vault projects, SBOM, Policy as Code, and all these good stuff. So it's going to be a lot of fun. And now, David, thank you so much, first of all, for joining us. It was a lot of fun. We really learned a lot today. I think a lot of people were able to have a good understanding now of kind of why to pay attention to SBOM and the risk of supply chain. So I wanted to thank you for that. But now it's over to you for the parting words.
Okay, just a few parting words. Before using any software, it doesn't have to be open source software. Take a quick look at it. I found that even just a few minutes of evaluation before you start using something, you can learn a lot. Typically, there's more than one way to do something, so look at your options. Including things like, are they trying to develop it? Is there more than one developer? It doesn't seem to be maintained. Um, are they trying to develop secure software? And then that brings us back to the other things that I mentioned earlier. There's a lot of ways that you can really help make software far more secure than otherwise. So let me do the quick recap. First of all, if you develop software and you don't know how to haven't taken any courses or anything, please take a course. There's a free course from openssf.org. Go to the training site. If you manage software developers, get them to take a course. Doesn't have to be that one, but again, most software developers don't know how to do it, and so they can't do it. They don't know how. If you're open source software, try to get an OpenSSF best practices badge. Put tools in your pipeline. Look for problems. Get rid of the problems early. Monitor for known vulnerabilities. Turn on Dependabot or whatever. Basically turn on mechanisms to warn you about vulnerabilities that have been discovered in the code you can depend on. And then prepare to rapidly update. Use package managers. Use automated tests. And make it easy for your users to upgrade, use scorecards, use Salsa, and so on. And much more broadly, again, I mentioned earlier at the beginning, I just want to wrap up, we're going to have to continuously improve. Attackers do get better. Although it's rare, new kinds of attacks do get discovered. And so you need to be aware of those new kinds of attacks and say, oh, wait a minute, does that apply to me? And just like anything else you do in your software, you want to continuously improve. Thank you so very much for your time.
Thanks so much. Stay safe, everybody. We'll see you next Tuesday, 1 p.m. With Almond. Stay safe. Bye-bye.